animals are kind of invisible. And one of the main reasons is that we are developing. Everything that we think about in this anthropocentric mindset that exists, I think it's fueled by the idea that you're unable to see beyond your own needs. And that's a lived reality in Pakistan. A cat came into my life. Even though I physically rescued her, she was the one who mentally rescued me. And that's the day when I started seeing animals and who they really are. There is a direct requirement in Islam that all Muslims are a khalifa, which is basically a ruler. But the actual word is steward. I should go into the flood zone and rescue animals, and that we did. This is my theory of life. It's called Interspecies Justice. It means that whenever you interact with other beings, they have their own inherent rights. We have installed over 1,400 clean water projects, and they're for both for humans and animals. We're solving food security. We're making sure the environmental footprint is zero. We're removing the animals from the food equation. That's how I would say interspecies justice is in reality.
Hey, Altamush, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you, Jamie?
Yeah, really good. Well, it's such a pleasure to get to talk to you. I've followed your work for a while and I've listened to you on a few other podcasts too. So I feel like I know you a little bit already. So it's great to have the chance to talk to you here. I also wanted to say happy World Animal Day. It's auspicious timing. But one of the reasons I was particularly keen to talk to you, and you reached out to me as well, is because I think two of the themes we're going to cover today are really important. And we haven't really touched on them yet in the Sentientism podcast. And one of them is about Islam and how Islamic thinking affects our thinking about non-human animals and the environment. And the other one, critically important given what you and your countrymen have lived through recently, is animals in the context of disasters and animals as victims and maybe as survivors in those contexts. So those are at least two of the themes I know we're going to cover today. But I put that in the context of what I'm trying to do in this podcast and with the Sentientism Worldview project overall is really try and answer some of the deepest philosophical questions like what's real, how should we understand the universe, and critically questions like who matters, who should be included in our ethics and our morality. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop Sentientism as this really broad pluralistic worldview that answers the what's real question with evidence and reason and a broadly naturalistic approach, but it answers the who matters question with a sentiocentric moral scope. If you like, at least all sentient beings, any being that can feel or can experience, should matter to us in our ethics. But I'm lucky in these conversations to talk to a broad range of people, whether they agree with sentientism or not. So it's going to be really interesting to dig into your philosophical journey and how that underpins the work you do today. But before we get onto those, how would you best introduce yourself to our audience for those who don't know you?
Firstly, I'm really grateful to be here. And I love how you're thinking about these things, what's real and what we can do about it. Because I think without having the right intention and having a framework, we cannot ourselves see what we want to do, and we cannot help other people see, what they want to do as well. So I think that's really brilliant and very much to the point. So to introduce myself, my name is Altamush. Of course, I'm from Pakistan and I'm a lawyer. I actually have 3 masters. One of them is in animal law. The other one is environmental law. And the last one is human rights and international law. So you can make a connection. This is how my life has been going on. And I always see the 3 disciplines as together. I teach animal law and environmental law in Pakistan, which you might find very shocking, but I've tried to develop that field at a law school. And I also run a nonprofit that I've been running since 2016. Back then, I didn't know what I was doing, but I'm pretty sure my framework is, which is Interspecies Justice. So I'll explain what that means later. And I think it's very similar to Sentientism, actually. And lastly, I recently founded my country's first ever animal and environmental law firm. So we offer free animal legal aid to anybody across the country. It's not a financially good model, but I think we need it, especially in Pakistan, where the movement does not exist. And very recently, I also became a filmmaker. So I'm making an animal advocacy series based on law on different animals. And I just finished one on farm animals, which will go eventually live in 10 days at a veg fest in Vietnam. And some other really cool stuff is coming up, which I will share later, because I think this is not about me and more about the idea. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, the first challenge of this interview was you summarizing who you are and what you do, because we follow each other on LinkedIn, and always feels like you're doing the work of at least 10 people. So I'm amazed you managed to summarize it, but thank you. It's an incredible range of work. So let's dig into your philosophy then. So the first of these questions is about what's real. And I tend to focus more on how do we work that out than, what do we believe? But an interesting way into the topic is often to understand people's journey with respect to religion and the supernatural, and whether they grew up in that sort of context or one that was maybe more atheistic or agnostic or scientifically minded, or a combination of the two, and how that's changed over their life if it has. So I don't know if you wanted to tell us that story about how you grew up and your worldview now in the context of religion.
That's a very good question. And I think what you're hinting at is, our personal lived realities and where we are from, because that kind of shapes us who we are. So, I mean, for one person, it's a 6. For another person, it's 9. Pretty common example. But I think I've had actually multiple identities throughout my whole life. Firstly, I was born in Pakistan. So it has two things that are very much connected. Firstly, it's a developing country. So the economics and financials played a huge role. And personally, we didn't come, from a very good, proper economic background. Of course, my parents worked really hard. They're doctors. So as a result, I got really good education, something that's not common in Pakistan for everybody. So that was the first privilege that I have. So I'm just counting my privileges first. And of course, I had my parents and everybody else in my family. However, what's associated furthermore with Pakistan is that animals are kind of invisible. And one of the main reasons coming back is the part that we are developing. So everything that we think about in this anthropocentric mindset that exists, I think it's fueled by the idea that you're unable to see beyond your own needs. And, until they're not being met at a proper scale, we should still do it. It's kind of really hard for people to see beyond human beings. And that's a lived reality in Pakistan. And I accept it and I, acknowledge it. That's why whenever I'm working around these issues, I'm always, like you, asking people where they're coming from. Because you can give a same answer, same meaning, but a different context that will make sense to them. So those are two of my identities. And of course, then Pakistan is also an Islamic nation. Islam is actually part of our constitution. So we're legally an Islamic country. So it's quite slightly different. So we have laws on Islam as well. And interestingly, we also have laws on animal rights in Islam that are codified. However, not implemented properly for other reasons. So those are kind of the ways I grew up. So initially, I didn't see animals. I only saw human rights. And I'll just be honest, that's how I started my nonprofit. I wanted to do good. That's the only thing I knew. But this is something you already know. A cat came into my life in 2018, and her name is Mao. And even though I physically rescued her, she was the one who mentally rescued me. And that's the day when I started seeing animals and who they really are.
Yeah, wonderful. And can we come on to the animal topic in a little bit, maybe in the next question? Is that okay? It may be a little artificial to break these things up, but I was interested in particular in, the broader picture of the way you understand reality in the world, particularly in an Islamic context, because I think you were brought up Muslim and you are Muslim now, and that clearly is an important part of framing how you understand the world. I guess I had a couple of questions in this what's real space. One is your religious belief an article of faith for you, or a matter of a personal revelation of a religious experience, or a respecting of authority in texts or people? Or is it more a question of evidence and reason, and something where you think, I get information from reality, my understanding of those things logically has led me rationally to a belief? Which of those paths underpins your belief system, if it's possible to answer that question?
So I think this might be a bit interesting. For me, it's actually both of them. So initially, I do believe in the text, of course. We have a written text in Quran, and we are taught about that from a very young age. We pray and, understand the concept of community, good human rights stuff. But there are some revelations that are part of the religion that I started reading them after I was connected with, animals. So there is a direct requirement in Islam that, all Muslims are a khalifa, which is basically a ruler, but the actual word is steward. It's like a sovereign who has a responsibility for everybody. That's not how it's normally read. The way it's read is that you are the most superior being and everything has been made for you, and you actually have divine permission to do anything, including eating animals. That's how we're normally taught that way. But I kind of use reason. And the most driving reasoning force for me was the mercy of Allah. We in Islam, our God is, of course, we refer to him as Allah. And the thing is, there are constant references that his mercy overpowers his anger. So I was, never able to comprehend the idea, how can mercy be limited to a being that God has created? And animals are mentioned in many ways in the scripture itself. And one of the most powerful ones, actually, people should know about, and this is where the veganism framework actually gets aligned with Islam. This is something very new. So I'm writing on it and helping people understand, because whenever you connect veganism and Islam, people kind of think that's not possible, because it does say at many places that you can eat that. However, it never says that you actually have to. Like, there's no mandatory requirement. And there are some other principles of faith, of empathy, of mercy that I mentioned before, where you can extend these principles. For example, you might not even know, because people generally believe that Islam is actually for the subjects who actually pray to God. However, it's also mentioned that animals pray to God as well in the Quran. That is interesting, right? And one of the best examples I'll give you is actually a frog. So the sound that the frog makes, it's actually a prayer to God. And he does that his whole life. So in our religion, the Prophet Muhammad, as you might know about him, basically was the messenger to which the book came, and is the person we all believe in as Muslims. Loved the frog for this reason. An almost ugly animal in a way, we don't think about a frog. We should. But it's beauty that's found everywhere. And the Quran also mentions that animals are actually a community. The term community is really powerful because it translates to the Arabic word ummah. And ummah really means those people or those beings for whom the religion is created. And animals are referred there. However, at the same time, that same revelation does not mention, for example, marine animals. The reason for that is when Islam came, it was in the desert, right? It was Arabia. So the thing is, you have to have that ideology that the religion's meaning will change with time. So before then, we didn't have any factory farms. Now we do. How do we apply the same principle there?
Is it fair to say that the core of your religious belief is about faith and the authority of the Quran, but you use evidence and reason to interpret or adapt and cope with changing situations and draw those core ideas of, compassion through into practice? Is that the balance? So in a sense, the core of your belief is an article of faith, in that there isn't really evidence that would shake that in any way, but you do use evidence and reason to adapt and cope and pull compassion through your interpretation. Is that a fair?
It would be. I mean, it's just extension of mercy, and I think times will change and everything is going to change, so you have to extend it. And for example, one very simple ideology that you will also agree with, and other Muslims will too, the thing is, human rights are very strongly mentioned in religion. And if you do anything that harms humans, that's perfectly 100% impermissible.
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting thing to come through. So and we're really coming on to the second big question of, I guess, what matters, but also who matters. And that's, I guess, what you're already starting to talk about here in the context of Islam, because like with many religions, there are obvious rich themes of, compassion and community and care that run through Islam. But there are also interpretations of Islam that can seem more hierarchical, that can seem to justify forms of discrimination like sexism and homophobia, that can lead to discrimination against outgroups or non-believers, and sometimes brutal and harsh treatment. So there are, as with any religious worldview, there are lots of different varieties, some which focus more on the universality and the compassion and the togetherness and the plurality, and some which don't. So you were already starting to explain, sorry for cutting you off, but yeah, how does your interpretation of, in the human ethics space, how does Islam flow through that for you? And then we can come on to the animal question.
So in the human ethics space, I think it's actually very, very clear. Rights for human beings are mentioned explicitly. However, I do think there have been some mistranslations because, again, if you extend this concept of mercy, it is explicitly mentioned that men and women are equal in the religion, So not extending right to women is something that I do not understand, and that does not fall under Islam in any way. However, the interpretations can be slightly different. For example, the story behind the hijab, for example, people might not know about it, but the main idea was it was actually a symbol of rich people in Arabia. And it was basically used to protect women from sunlight because it was really harsh in the desert. That was the original idea. Then it has been reformed and changed into something entirely else. And it was a choice for the women themselves if they wanted to. There was no binding requirement on either side to wear one or not to wear one.
And is it fair to say that there's an additional challenge in Islam because of the centrality of the Quran itself? I think in some other religious contexts, there's a lot more comfort with adapting and, if you like, cherry picking different parts of it. So in Christianity, for example, people do that all the time. There are, thousands of different Christian sects, and they all choose different parts of the Bible and emphasize other things. My understanding in an Islamic context is there's much more focus on the Quran itself being, the unchallengeable word of God. So does that make it a little bit harder in some circumstances to interpret or adapt or to change things over time? How's that handled?
Well, I think it's both a good thing and a bad thing, because if you are able to connect your ideas with a central focused book, it's very much possible that the ideas won't change with time when people leave. However, at the same time, if the interpreters are themselves, not sure or have not been exposed to these different lived realities of what Islam actually says about animals, or just humans, if they have not seen how human suffering is happening around communities where they live, it would be really hard for them. And I'm talking about imams right now. Imams are kind of the central focus, the leading legal authority in Islam. Whatever they say is kind of considered as the way Islam is supposed to be. However, there are differing opinions between them as well. There are so many sects in the religion. So the centrality is actually kind of not true anymore. And it's changing, it's evolving. So everybody kind of takes in something that aligns with their own ideology. But however, the book itself stays central. So I would say it's both of them. But this also creates a solution, which I'll talk about later, because that's come later, right?
Sounds good. Thank you. So that's a really interesting perspective. So let's come on to the broader who matters part of this question, because again, I'm interested in your personal journey, how you thought this stuff through, even as a kid, right? Because most of us as children start out with, family and friends around us, and we care about them, obviously. And then we experience the wider world and we learn, and, in your case, you learn about the religion and other perspectives too. And your moral scope extends out. You can think about concepts like the Ummah, or you think about broader humanity. And then hopefully at some critical point, people realize that humans aren't the only ones who matter too. And we start to think about non-human animals. So what was your journey like on that sort of moral scope question, from even, your time as a kid to where you are now? What were the stages you went through just broadening your moral scope?
So I think I've always been more closer to my morality ever since I was a kid. And I know that's a weird statement, because as children, you don't know what you're doing. So I'll give you a real life story. So this was when I was just 14 years old, and there was a drug abuse issue in my community. For 14 years old, it's a very big issue, and I didn't know what I was going to do. But what we did was, as a community, we started a soccer tournament, or a football tournament, if you understand the word. And I love soccer. I've played sports my whole life, and I think it brings the whole community together. It's just beautiful.
Yeah, we call it football, but we'll allow soccer for the purposes of the interview.
won't allow soccer, actually. I would prefer football.
I do have an American audience too, so we might have to translate for them.
Exactly. So we started that in 2012 with just some kids, and by 2017, in consecutive summer tournaments of football and soccer, we basically shifted every single kid in our community from drugs to football or soccer. And that was something I'd already done when I was, around 16. And even then, I didn't know what I was doing, but that kind of compelled me to the idea that human rights and I need to do more. So I wanted to set up an NGO, and that's how it kind of started. At that point, I started joining these protests about animal rights, but that only happened because of my cat. So as I told you, one of the realities being in Pakistan is animals are actually invisible. There's just some kind of a barrier. Just people don't see beyond humans. And one of them is money and everything else. But I had that too. And I'll just be honest. But my cat helped me overcome it. And that's why I always say, even though physically I rescued her, mentally she was the one who rescued me. And a true story, didn't know about spay neuter at all, what that meant. So she went out, got back pregnant, came back home, gave birth to 5 babies. They still live with us. And they're over 5 years old now. And she's actually my mentor and my non-human role model. And she's taught me about animal rights more than anybody. And that kind of kickstarted a lot of work. So, for example, then unfortunately the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and I was still a student at my school. So we started a movement and we did lots of human rights work, but at the same time, we felt that, community animals in our areas do not have access to food anymore because normally they rely on leftovers. So we started a campaign for them. Pretty small, but it's still going on. And then, of course, another flood happened in 2022 where I was actually a better student. I was doing my master's in animal law, so I was surrounded by animals everywhere. And I felt that you could, and, without any proper expertise, I should go into the flood zone and rescue animals, farm animals, particularly myself. And that we did. So we created this ideology and I live by it. Normally organizations have a theory of change. This is my theory of life. It's called Interspecies Justice. So it's basically an idea that human, animal, and environmental rights are connected. However, that connection goes beyond just a connection. It means that whenever you interact with other beings, they have their own inherent rights. I personally believe every life form is sentient. Even the earth is sentient. But of course, the earth does not have the ability to feel pain. So that's slightly different. So when you keep adding more matrices to the sentientism idea, you have to extend and acknowledge that those beings have their own inherent rights. So the ability to feel pain and suffer means that you have a right to life.
And that's an interesting interpretation because I tend to use the definition of sentience that focuses on the capacity to have experiences, which include to feel pain. So I would say, we might choose to care about the earth or plants, but if they don't feel pain, if they don't feel anything, then I don't think they're sentient. So maybe we're just using different definitions. But it's interesting because you can still go beyond, and many people do go beyond sentience in terms of granting moral consideration. And it seems like that's something you do. So sentience, the capacity to feel pain, for example, is very important to you, and it drives certain rights. But at the same time, your concept of justice goes even beyond that, even to include entities and things that don't feel
pain. I think they still do feel something.
Oh, really? So you think do you think the earth is actually having some form of experience?
Yeah, and I can prove that to you.
Wow.
It's very scientifically. So you would agree with the fact that, the earth has had over 5 mass extinctions so far. You agree with that, right?
Yeah.
It's scientific. So the thing is, I consider that as Earth's own resetting mechanism. So the thing is, the Earth will do everything in its power to make sure that it survives. And that survival mechanism might also mean human extinction or extinction of other beings. But that would mean, the uncontrolled carbon emissions or temperature cycles that we're changing. We're basically affecting the Earth's resetting mechanism, and it's going to do everything in its power to save itself. A being that wants to stay alive is inherently sentient. But of course, the ability to feel pain creates more rights. So it's kind of like a platform or a process that just keeps on going.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
But with time, you get more realities. You understand, hey, I didn't think about that. So it keeps on evolving. It's an evolution stage sentientism idea.
Thank you. Yeah, and my sense is that the earth is inanimate and cannot care and does not care about anything. It's just a thing, and it would be just as happy to be like Venus or Mars as it would be to be like Earth. So I don't think of the Earth as a sentient being or as a being at all. I think it's just a thing. But at the same time, I recognize the richness and power of the sort of ecosystem connections and those feedback loops and those different systems and how those work. And that can feel like a reaction to the things we're doing, but I don't think it's a conscious reaction to the things we're doing. I think this is just physics running, but then even consciousness is just physics running too. So
No, I like your answer. So that made it very easy for me. So what I'm saying is the Earth has the ability to react. I'm just saying it's not conscious reaction.
Yeah.
So that's how I define
that makes sense. Yeah. And the other thing I like about your approach, because I mean, personally, I'm quite strict about sentience in that I think, I do care about rocks, rivers, trees, the earth as Gaia, all of that other stuff. But I only care about those because they're important to the sentient beings. I think if there were no sentient beings on a planet, like there probably aren't on Venus or Mars, I don't think there's any moral significance to that planet. And if there were no sentient beings on Earth, I don't think there would be any moral significance to the planet. So I'm quite strict about it. But at the same time, sentientism is quite open-minded. As long as every sentient being gets to matter, you can go further if you want. And I like the approach you take, because you're saying, okay, we can care more broadly than sentience, or the ability to feel pain is still special, right? It is a different level that drives different rights that, and that's one thing I'm really keen to hold on to, because there's a danger with some people who go for a sort of more biocentric, ecocentric thing, that they almost do this sort of ethical flattening thing where it's like almost everything matters, so nothing does. So there's, they end up in a position where there's no moral difference between cutting the throat of a pig and cutting the grass. And I'm like, I think you've made a big mistake there.
Yeah, I don't go there. Yeah, no, that doesn't apply.
That's great. Thank you. Well, so that was your journey thinking about animals, and an introduction to some of the amazing work you've already been doing to help their lives. One final question on this ethical thing is, you talked about rights and you've talked about justice, but going back to your experience with the cat in your family and now the cats in your family, what's the root of that? Is it more a sort of intellectual sense of fairness and justice, a sort of legalistic thing? Is it more of an emotional, empathic connection with their experience, imagining what it's like to be them? Is it all of the above? How did that mix play through for you? Because I've talked to people who, some have a very emotional, empathic drive. Some have a much more intellectual justice and rights and fairness drive, and many people have a mix of both. What's it for you?
So I don't think I've ever put a pin on it, because it could be a mixture of everything. But I do acknowledge this idea that I have to understand that leaving a cat at your home and you're outside for the whole day working is kind of a stage of captivity for the animal, or it's being prison in a way. But the unfortunate reason why, I do it and I make sure that doesn't happen is because the roads are not safe anymore in Pakistan. That's a kind of a different reality. And I've actually lost a few cats for that reason, for the road accidents, and I just cannot do that anymore. But at the back of my head, I have to make sure that I'm not keeping them captive. So they're free to roam everywhere, but just in an area where they're not safe. And I know there is some paternalism coming in here, and I have to fight it every day, but I do acknowledge it.
But it's also, paternalism isn't always a bad thing, right? Sometimes they need our paternalism, right? It's similar with our own, my own kids, although they tend to be rejecting my paternalism these days. But paternalism isn't always bad when it's genuinely in the best interests of the other.
I think so. Yeah, I like your idea. I like your words, man. That's really good. It's very profound. So yeah, I think it's more about how do they feel inside my home. That's how I try to think.
It's their perspective.
I always extend that perspective to other animals, just like them. Hey, if I'm, getting this amazing company of a cat, but what about other cats that are suffering right now, or other farm animals? So it just keeps on going. It extends to every animal. So everything that I've done is because of my cat, and I've done so much, and I'm gonna do so much more.
They're quite an inspiration. So really, your cat deserves most of the credit here.
Absolutely, 100%.
That's a lovely story. Thank you. So I wanted to come back to the question of Islam and non-human animals, because you already introduced the idea before that's, I think, quite common across the Abrahamic religions, where there's this sense of a hierarchy where, God is obviously at the top of the hierarchy. Depending on the religion, you might have, angels and some other sort of supernatural beings that are next. Then you have sort of very privileged humans, often a sort of priestly class, who are sometimes intermediaries or interpreters of, or and there might even be prophets. Obviously, there's a very deeply important role for that within Islam. And then you have humans, and at least the humans within the religion, and the humans within the religion are seen as maybe made in the image of God, but they are separate from the rest of reality and often granted some form of dominion or power or control or rights over others. So that's one interpretation that's quite common within the Abrahamic religions. And you talked about that also being one of the ways that some people think about Islam too, and that drives how they think about how we engage with the environment and non-human animals. So did you want to tell us a little bit more about, how you're trying to bring a different view that takes the central idea of mercy and extends that out? Is there more to say on your perspective on Islam and non-human animals?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Quran itself mentioned through the teachings of the Prophet that the Prophet was actually sent as a mercy to all mankind, and included humans, animals, jinns, and all life that exists. It's written. Everybody knows about it.
And So that includes all humankind. So does that mean not just Muslims, but it also includes all
Yes.
animals? And it
Yes.
includes all
Yes.
animals as well. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. It also includes the supernatural, the jinns as well. They're also mentioned.
Yeah. So that is properly universal, right? That's like basically absolutely everybody. I mean,
So the mercy was actually sent for everybody. And however, because of this normal, traditional, anthropocentric way of how Islam is taught, that, that humans are at the top. And I mean, above humans is okay. I mean, angels, the prophets, the God, that's okay. That makes sense. There's some kind of authority where the religion flows from. However, the word that's consistently ignored in the religion is the word that I mentioned before, is that of a Khalifa. So a Khalifa is basically God's messenger or his appointee on earth, not messenger, but appointee, or who basically makes sure that the legislative command is followed. However, the responsibilities of a Khalifa go beyond humans. They go to animals and the environment. And there's actually a very good story about it. So there was one Khalifa named Umar bin Khattab, and he basically made a statement that there was a famine at that time in Arabia. And he said that even if a dog is going without food, I will be responsible for it. That was the ideology of Khalifas. And the thing is, it's not just a ruler who's a Khalifa. Every Muslim present on this planet is a Khalifa. That's a responsibility. So I always interpreted that dominion thing to be false and more about my test, I know that's still anthropocentric, and it's my test that I take care of other beings more. But as a result, the other beings do get their rights because it's inherently in them. I don't have to give them away. God gave them. They're already born with it. And that includes animals and the environment as well. So my job is to make sure that they're properly implemented. That's Islam. And that's how veganism becomes a part of it as well.
Yeah. When we're thinking about, obviously veganism is just one part of the wider ideas about representing and caring about non-human animals, but it's a deeply important part because of the scale of the animal agriculture industry and the cultural resonance of many of the animal-based foods that humans eat around the world. So are there any particular things about the consumption of animals in Islam that people misinterpret or should be aware of?
It's actually other than consumption. It's more about the way the animal is kept and the way it's treated before consumption. So those are referred to as halal and tayyib regulations. Normally, people only know about halal. And this is just so shocking for me. How did they forget the tayyib part? And I think you might have heard the word before. You might have definitely heard halal, but have you heard the word tayyib before by any chance?
No, I don't think so, no.
Yeah, so that's the problem. So even Muslims don't know about it. So halal is basically a set of guidelines how the animal has to be treated. And they're very, very strict. So you have to make sure that the animal does not suffer, because an injured animal cannot be sacrificed. And injury can be both physical and mental. Nobody thinks about mental. So as a result, there are further requirements that if you do slaughter an animal, you have to take care of it. You have to make sure that you know that it has not suffered in its life. And when you're actually about to slaughter it, the mental part becomes much more stronger. So you cannot slaughter an animal in part of another one. You have to make sure that your blade is very sharp. You have to make sure that you know the process. Normally what happens is anybody just gets up and just slaughters an animal. That's not allowed in Islam. And what people also think is that, okay, if we messed up, if we just say the name of God, then it just certainly becomes halal. That's also not true. And that is something the industry hides from the world. Just making it more realistic, Brazil is actually from where the world's highest amount of halal meat is actually exported. And these requirements, because there is no centralized halal authority, that basically says that you have to follow exactly this, industries take advantage of it. That's just one part of it. And I've never in my own life seen proper halal guidelines being followed, which basically implies that the animal is not properly slaughtered and therefore you cannot eat it. That's why the higher amount of requirements. But the tayyib part is actually even more important. The tayyib part is actually about cleanliness and making sure that, beyond injury and suffering, you have to give the animal a kind of a pure place that everything is clean. And that's where the human part also gets connected. So diseases, veterinary medication, and the entire process just being pure and clean. And I don't know how you can make slaughter clean. I just don't get it. And there are some other additional requirements which basically prohibit factory farming in the religion. I mean, these two basic ones kind of prohibit them, but there are explicit mentions that you must not cut the horns of animals or their tail or brand them or put them in places where they're confined and can suffer, because factory farming is kind of, quite opposite of it. So I can say this with 100% certainty, and anybody can watch it, that factory farming as it exists today is completely permissible in Islam. 100%.
Yeah. And globally, that's roughly 90% of all animal agriculture.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's fascinating. Thank you. Because there was some of that I was aware of and some I wasn't. It's always interesting how the human mind works because, I agree. If you have those restrictions around cleanliness, I'm not sure how any slaughterhouse can comply with those requirements. But also, if you really take the spirit of the ideas that sit behind halal, which does seem to be coming from, a care for the animals, is a care for their mental well-being, their physical well-being. If you take that principle, I don't think it's possible to kill an animal that doesn't want to be killed without causing it physical pain or mental pain, and certainly not to its family either. So is there any space in the Islamic world for taking the sort of good intent that sits behind ideas like halal, but then saying what that should really mean is actually a transition away from animal agriculture and exploitation completely? I mean, it seems almost analogous to what I sometimes try to do with people who talk about animal welfare in the animal agriculture industry, is that say, look, I'm glad you care about welfare and I'm glad you want things to be humane, but if you're really serious about what these words mean, it doesn't mean just torture a bit less while you exploit and kill. It means stop the exploitation and killing, right? I mean, it means particularly when there's really obvious alternatives we could transition to now. So how do you think the dynamics would work there? Because it almost feels like you can either work with those concepts and take them to a better place, or you could try and add something extra on from the outside and say, and on top of that, we should be vegan for other reasons. But how do you think about that?
So I just want to start with that I love your question, and it gave me some two amazing ideas that I'm going to share with you right now. So the thing is, intention is very important in Islam. So the thing is, when you label something as humane or when you argue that you're doing animal welfare, your intention is in the wrong place. What you're actually doing is you're making sure that humans kind of feel happy or less guilty when they actually do the act itself, and that humans get a higher amount of meat product or disease-free meat product so they can eat more. And, that's intentionally not animal welfare. That's where Islam doesn't allow that. You have to be intentional, because the status of not being non-intentional and saying something else makes you a hypocrite. And hypocrites are, the people who are referred to as the most least indignified people in the religion, the most worst people ever. So, but you will not hear this a lot, but I just wanted to mention that. And secondly, a very touching pain point, so I'll go there very smoothly, is about Eid al-Adha, the great slaughter event that happens in Islam. So the thing is, the idea about the slaughter itself was sacrificing oneself, and actually oneself, a part of yourself that you don't want to, but you are doing it for the sake of Allah. So what originally happened in the story was God commanded the Prophet Ibrahim to sacrifice his own son for the love of God through a dream. And he was actually about to do it. And what he was actually sacrificing was a part of his own soul, his love. He actually loved his son, because I don't think anybody of us in the current lives can, even harm our children because we love them, right? So that was the basic idea, that you love something so much that giving it up is going to hurt you. It's going to basically actually mean that you're sacrificing yourself. That was the essence. And the other thing that happened was when the Prophet was about to sacrifice his son, the son was replaced by a sheep or a lamb. We're not sure exactly what the animal was, but some kind of a farm animal. So that was kind of, interpreted, or I would say misinterpreted, into what happens right now. So what happens right now is there are huge animal markets, and there are some regulations on transportation in Islam as well, not explicitly written. But, when you expose them to higher distances and you increase the stocking density, the pain part is inevitable, and that makes the whole slaughter impermissible. But because of these huge animal markets, animals have to be flown away or driven by ship even, and even on land for more than 3 to 4 days. That's not allowed. So that kind of takes away the whole essence and idea. And so what I basically argue is that if you really want to sacrifice an animal, you have to really, get connected with it so much that when you're sacrificing it, you're sacrificing oneself. That is really hard, because then you're going to ask someone, if you've lived with a pet for 10 years and you're being asked to sacrifice it, that pain that you feel there, that's the essence of the sacrifice. That's lost.
As an aside, and this might be unfair to say, and it's the same in the Christian tradition as well, right? I think that is the act of a sadistic God, is to ask someone to make that sort of sacrifice. But, we can put that to one side. I struggle with that. I really struggle with, I would never ask someone else to make that sort of sacrifice, right? It seems like I don't understand why. But we don't need to get into that. That's sort of back to the religion topic. But
yeah, I know. That just makes it a really, really hard test. I know. I agree with you. But so the essence was sacrificing oneself. And that does not happen anymore, even at the Eid al-Adha stage. You just get an animal 2 days from the date of slaughter and just slaughter it. There is no connection. So therefore, you're missing that essence. And the thing is, when you connect the mercy principle...
It's like a tokenistic echo of the original request. It's not related to it at all, right? Yeah, bizarre.
At all. You don't feel anything.
Yeah.
And the other thing is when you extend the... Yeah, exactly. But when you extend the mercy principle, what you can do is you can think about, okay, so if I'm going to sacrifice something of my own, and if I can do it in a better, merciful way, I can basically help a student go to school for his life. I can give poor people food. I can start a hospital. I can do other stuff that's going to, actually mean something.
A sacrifice that helps others, right? Not a pointless sacrifice, one that really helps others. That's a good sacrifice, yeah.
Yeah, and it's for God. So you just extend the mercy, and that's how I fit in veganism there. Of course, I cannot say to somebody, stop it, but I can give them this ideology.
Yeah. Thank you. I love it. So let's come on to the final question about how do we make a better world in that context. And you've talked already about some of the things you were doing in the world of activism, even from the age of 14. So you've got quite a history here, both in the human sphere and the non-human animal sphere and environmentalism as well. So this is quite a tricky topic to cover because you cover so much and you do so much. But I will let you answer the question about how do we make a better world in any way you like. And that can be a grand utopian global vision. I'm obviously very interested in the particular context of Pakistan and how do we make things better for the people and the non-human animals and the environment there and the particular challenges of that. And we can come on to the specific work you've been doing around animals as victims and survivors in disaster situations too. But maybe start with the big answer. What's your ideas about how do we make a better world in general?
So I think I'm going to start with the framework, and I'm going to explain it even more. And I think that framework is interspecies justice for me. So the idea is whenever you do anything, you have to think about other life forms. So the thing is, if I'm limited by my own lived experience, as a result, I'm only going to focus on what I have seen in my life, right? So you have to help those people whenever they're making policy or doing anything to think about the other lived experiences as well. So if somebody only knows about human rights, he has a responsibility to know about environmental and animal rights from somebody else who's an expert. So nothing is missed out. And if you have that, whatever you do is going to impact everybody and give them their rights. That's my framework of changing the world. And that's what we do. And I have lots of examples about it. So, for example, in Pakistan, we have installed over 1,400 clean water projects. They're carbon neutral, and they're both for humans and animals. And now what we're doing is we're extending that same water to develop green vegetable gardens across the country. So we're solving food security. We're making sure the environmental footprint is actually zero. And we are using solar technology, of course. And then at the same time, we're removing the animals from the food equation. So that fixes everything. And that's how I would say interspecies justice is in reality.
That's a great example. So the water is for human and non-human animals together. And it's also improving plant agriculture, which displaces the need for animal agriculture all at once. I love it. Yeah.
So we're creating these green vegetable gardens across Pakistan. So this project happens across the country and it's at a very, very big scale. So I'm pretty sure millions of animals and humans benefit already, but our goal in the next couple of years is to make over 1,600 of these green vegetable gardens as well. so we can change something at a very big level. That's just one example.
How do the human animals react to the fact that the water is for non-human animals as well? Does that seem strange to them, or is it natural and accepted?
So I normally term that as DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. So the thing is, you're creating a space where humans and animals can interact, and when humans bring in their children, but the understanding that they're getting is that their children have the same needs as animals. So we're trying to bring change within themselves, and we don't tell them anything. So there's no board, there's nothing. There's just a space. So people bring in their animals, and the animals get help as a result. And this connects very beautifully to the idea of victimhood of animals in disasters. So droughts are common in Pakistan, but ever since we have been installing these water projects, the possibility of droughts affecting animals is also going down. So we're fixing that problem. But then, of course, we have floods and other issues. So acknowledging that animals, have zero part to play in disasters, they are therefore 100% victims. And unfortunately, in my country, under the National Disaster Management Act, there are no protection for animals killed in disasters. And that's true for actually the whole world, except a few countries. And that's too also very minimalistic. For example, the US has laws on companion animal protection in disasters, but that's still anthropocentric because the humans don't want to lose their companion animals. And that same principle is being extended in New Zealand, Indonesia, and just very few other countries. On the biggest international level, we have the United Nations Sendai frameworks, and what they also refer to as is animals as livelihood or property. So in the international disaster framework, animals are still, not even considered victims. They're just property and livelihood. And as a result, their protections are almost always ignored. And that's what I want to change. I want to work on and create this new area called International Animal Disaster Law, so people acknowledge it. And the thing is, the way it exists right now, it's actually anti-animal disaster law right now, because many countries have subsidies available for farmers that they can let their animals die and they get money per head. So that's even worse. And at the same time, I just want to mention one more thing that's very important. It's actually about agriculture. So people completely ignore, and the industry ignores as well, and the government too, that agriculture is the cause of disaster, the way it's done right now. And that's why the floods happen in Pakistan as well. But nobody is willing to make that connection. And what really happens after disasters happen is people have a higher need for food. And then they rely again on those agriculture factory farming systems, which then again causes more disasters. So countries like mine can never leave that cycle. And it's been exploited. And that's the most horrible thing about this whole non-acceptance of victimhood of animals in disasters.
Yeah, it's a painful cycle. And one of my previous guests, Crystal Heath, has been digging into that in the US, where, again, that idea where, to some degree, the animal agriculture industry drives climate change, which then causes a disaster, which destroys an animal farm, drowning or killing tens of thousands of chickens and pigs. Then people's money is taken by the government to pay those industries, to sometimes to kill extra animals and then to force breed more and round the cycle goes. And it sounds like there's a similar sort of pattern within Pakistan, although with a different flavor, no doubt.
It's a world pattern, actually. Unfortunately, it's a world pattern.
Yeah, and the approach you're taking in terms of disasters is fascinating because it's another area where actually I think public opinion gives me some hope and is ahead of the law, because one of the dynamics in disaster situations, and there's fascinating work being done around war as well, and considering the impact on non-human animals of war, in both those situations, whether it's a natural disaster or human-caused disasters, there's an understandable focus in the crisis to say, well, we need to help the humans first. So it's that anthropocentric default. And you can sort of understand that, right? My priority will be my family around me first, right, in a disaster. So that pulls empathy and compassion maybe away from non-human animals. But at the same time, you do see a genuine grassroots public outpouring of compassion for the animals impacted in wars and natural disasters, even amongst people who buy dead animal products 3 times a day, right? But those people will still care about wild animals and domesticated animals that are being harmed, that are survivors of these things. So it's another strange area where, for some people it makes them more anthropocentric, but for some other people it actually broadens their compassion out, and they really are ready to help and engage with wild animals, which, it's a topic that technically goes way beyond veganism, because veganism is mostly focused on ending the human caused harms. It's not necessarily focused on helping animals in the wild that are responding to natural disasters, or even the day-to-day problems of wild animals. So it's a weird balance. But what's the dynamic like in Pakistan around those types of things when you're trying to get people to help non-human animals in response to a disaster where human animals are really struggling?
So yeah, unfortunately, you hit the nail on the head. We do have to sometimes use these anthropocentric frameworks. So the thing is, if we don't mention the farmer, for example, don't let your animals die. We will, heal them and take care of them. They actually have no incentive to save them. So you have to create some kind of a dynamic where you're technically saying to them that you're helping them, but you are basically treating and making sure that the animals don't die for no reason in those disasters. And we are actually developing some trainings to work with the government on doing this on a very bigger scale. And that's going to happen next year. And right now, we actually have created my country's first ever disaster zone farm animal shelter. So it's for farm animals, but it's also an ideology that animals are victims and they do need space when disasters happen where veterinarians and other people can come together to actually rescue and save them. And yeah, it's a developing area. I wanted to mention one more thing. So Islam actually had rights of nature as well, something that people might not know about. So the earth is actually referred to as being in humankind's trust. And by trust, I mean the ownership is God's. We're just the trustees. And in the similar relationship, we don't own it. So we have responsibility towards everything. And God also mentions that, if you violate that trust, natural disasters will happen. It's mentioned in the religion.
So it's not just a scientific story about climate change impacting you. There's a religious, you're being punished for this. You did wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. And there's one other mention about animal protection in disasters. So this was a story about the Prophet Noah when the great flood happened. So God commanded the Prophet to basically take a pair of species of every animal he put with them on the ship. He didn't give a reason, but the logical explanation is that, life cannot survive without animal life. That's what I brought from it. And it's mentioned in the Quran as well.
Yeah. So there's an environmental rights and environmental concern aspect that flows through too. Yeah. Thank you. So on the animal agriculture space, I'm interested in digging a little bit into that context in Pakistan, because I know that's as a vegan, that's another transition you'd love to see happen. But the dynamics are very different around the world. So in the UK here, for example, most people will only really see domestic animals or selected wild animals that live around them. They might occasionally see farm animals in the occasional field, but most of animal agriculture is separated, hidden away, and very heavily industrialized and quite concentrated too. So that dynamic, in a way, the theory of change there tends to be about, yes, we should shift subsidies, we should enable those farmers and those industries to transition. There might be new products that could displace animal products. We want to work on consumers to go vegan and to boycott these industries and to shift and transition. And you can sort of see how that dynamic might work over time, because there's a very small number of people actually involved in the animal agriculture industries. They have a lot of political power and they have a lot of cultural power, but actually there's a very small number of people. It's quite concentrated. So the idea of transitioning that to a plant-based agricultural system and all the environmental benefits that would flow from that is still challenging, right? Culturally and socially, of course, it's hard, but practically it's quite simple, right? It's quite simple. We already have the answers we need. We could just, with the right political will and social norm shift, we could see that happening quite quickly. But things are different in a country like Pakistan. How does animal agriculture work there? How do people in general think about the animals in the agricultural systems? And what sort of transition path could you imagine that would work for Pakistan? A plant-based Pakistan, can you imagine it? And how could you ever get there?
Of course, I can imagine it. It's a dream. So the thing is, you would have to borrow from religion as well then, because it's just kind of, it's kind of like the most important thing. So while people will definitely start with the idea that you have divine permission to eat them, but the thing is, there are some additional rights that follow through as well. For example, if you don't want to talk about them, you can just talk about human health. So the thing is, and this is a true story. So in Pakistan, a new act supposedly called the Animal Health Act, is being made for the very sole purpose to maximize our exports of animal products, to basically decrease the disease risk so we can make more money. So I don't think at the end of the day it's about religion or culture. It's just about money. And they don't want that thing to come out, no matter what. So, I mean, I think the possible actual solution would be something that helps the industries keep the money and shift to plant-based. That's what I actually think. But my ideological answer, of course, is about including spaces where people talk about the climate change impacts of agriculture. So just today, I was at an event, I'm not going to mention it, and this was a minister responsible for livestock and dairy in Pakistan, so the actual agriculture industry. So he basically mentioned that this new Animal Health Act is being made. And then he said that because of climate change, animals agriculture is suffering. But he never mentioned the environmental impacts of animal agriculture.
We should have compassion for the industry. Really gets me. Yeah.
So the Animal Health Act that they're formulating, and I had a chance to look at it before it's being passed. It's not passed yet. There is not a single mention of the word environment or the environmental harms that the agriculture industry causes. I was like, why? And I mean, it was pretty obvious because it would hit their pockets. So for me, the solution has to be somewhere money. People don't care about anything else.
Yeah.
This is being, realistic, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think all of us would love a sort of deep-seated ethical transformation across the 8 billion humans, but we can't wait for that, right? We've got to pull some other incentive levers. And how much is the environmental impact of animal agriculture recognized, whether it's emissions or whether it's the more local stuff about, pollution, water, and in Pakistan? Yeah. I mean, given the catastrophic impacts the country has faced through things like flooding, is that something people think about? And even in more sort of local impacts, water pollution, air pollution, there's nothing.
So the impact is, of course, there. People are suffering, but there is zero mention of the environmental impact of agriculture, either in the law, either in the government, and therefore it's not also taught. So what I normally do is, and I always talk about the 2022 floods. So those happen because of global warming, right? And greenhouse gas emissions. And when I tell people that 1/3 of those greenhouse gas emissions came from these food systems that you live with, they just get blown away. And that's when they listen to me. Because then it's about their survival. So you have to somehow connect it back to them. But as of this point, absolutely zero. And I'm trying to change that by teaching environmental law in addition to animal law at law schools in Pakistan. And it's being done for the first time ever in the country. So it's a long journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I can hear your cat family in the background. So if you need to bring them in and introduce them or look after them, just let me know. I don't want to.
No, they're a bit far away.
So you touched on the topic of education there, and maybe that's one of the final things that I'd like to explore with you, because you're doing some genuinely groundbreaking work, both in the legal space, but around education and education around animal law as well. With this Sentientism project, part of the reason I'm focusing on it, but is because I think worldviews are deeply important. They underpin every human decision ultimately. So
absolutely.
And there is a sort of naive sort of vegan thing going on in my brain that I really do want to see people develop better epistemology and ethics, right? I want to solve the problems, but I really want people to be better as well, right? So I have this naive hope about education, and I'm doing some stuff in the UK at the moment where I'm working with schools and various teachers to sort of talk about these questions of epistemology and ethics, and particularly the animal question, and having a wonderful response from kids of all ages. But at the same time, it does feel a little bit naive. How do you think education in the Pakistan context could help shift things here?
It would, and the answer I'm going to give you is going to blow your mind away, actually. So I'm doing quite a few stuff in education. So I've recently collaborated with a Worldwide Fund for Nature in Pakistan, and I'm delivering these sessions on the environmental impact of agriculture to students. And I've given around 10 sessions in the last couple months, and I'm going to keep it going. And then I'm actually going to schools to teach about the exact same thing. But at the end, I'm going to give them plant-based food to actually eat. And I'm going to work with their school cafes to introduce at least one plant-based dish.
As you're having those conversations, because I have some of those conversations too, can you push non-human animal ethics in there at the same time? Can you, even if your main message is about environment, can you also say And of course, we should imagine what it's like to be them. Can you put the ethical angle in as well?
I do. So the thing is, and this might be very funny to you, actually, I start with the animal ethics angle and then I go to the environment. That's how I always do it. Yeah. So it kind of works because I talk about animal law and then I explain why the way it is. And then I talk about agriculture to drive the point home. So for me, it's always animal law first, environmental law second, but together. But the two solutions when it comes to education is, of course, the first thing that I'm already doing is developing these animal law and environmental law courses in Pakistan because we need more animal rights lawyers. I am unfortunately the only one with an animal law master's, and we need more of that because I personally think we need experts. We don't need, people in the middle because there's so much at stake for the animals. So if people, think that they're doing something good, but at the end it hurts animals, that's going to break my heart and that's going to break the animals. So I cannot afford that. But the other education thing that I'm working on, and this is going to be groundbreaking for you. So I'm making a curriculum on animal and environmental rights in Islam, and I'm going to teach it directly to imams in Pakistan. So imams are the points of all this, legal foundation of Islam, and educating them directly is going to amplify the message. Because if they get educated and we help them develop these sermons, they're going to hit at least 1,000 plus people just in 1 week. So the impact is going to be groundbreaking. And I'd finished the curriculum, actually. I was doing that in September. So right now I'm working with a few imams to improve it. And this project is actually incubated at the ProVeg Kickstarter for Good program. So they're also helping me. And we have built over 8 mosques so far. So we have 8 imams in our group, and we're going to train them as a pilot and see how it affects everything. But I have very high hope it's going to work out.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And have you, what sort, I don't know if you've had a chance to get any early feedback from imams. What sort of response do you get? Do you get much pushback, or is it engagement, or is it, how do you think it's going to go with that group?
I haven't talked to them yet because before that I was speaking with Muslims generally and vegan Muslims and other people who said that we need this thing. So then I finished building the curriculum, and now I'm just translating it to Urdu. It's going to, be done in 2 days. And then I'm going to go do imam with the curriculum and get it endorsed by them. But the thing is, of course, there are some anthropocentric notions in it. So I'm starting with social justice. I'm going to talk about women's rights in Islam. I'm going to talk about human rights. And then I'm going to jump in environmental and animal rights in Islam. So it's going to be everything. Because, it ties with my own framework that I'm not going to miss anybody out. So that's kind of justice for me.
That sounds wonderful. Good luck and keep me posted. And I'm fascinated to hear what what response you get from the imams as you work with them. Yeah. And like you say, it's all about coming back to that central idea of mercy and just following that through universally, right? It's not complicated, or it shouldn't have to be.
Absolutely. And the one other project that I'm doing right now is developing a plant-based curriculum that talks about the environmental impacts of agriculture and all its other impacts for students in Pakistan. So I'm doing that with New Roots Institute. You might have heard of them.
Yes, yeah.
So it's going to get launched next year for my country.
I interviewed Jesse Tandler from New Roots a couple of episodes ago. So yeah, wonderful work.
Perfect. Yeah. I'm a fellow there, so they're helping me.
Yeah, one of your many jobs. It's been absolutely wonderful to hear that story. Is there anything else you wanted to add into this? How to make a better world question? It feels like you've covered the bases pretty well. But...
Oh, well, I think what we can all do is create spaces for conversations about the ideas. It's okay if you, start with a wrong answer, but you have to have at least spaces where people can do some critical thinking. The exact question you asked me, what's real, what matters, how do we find a solution? If there's a space for these questions, I think change can come. And it's okay if you get the wrong answer in the first place. Somebody's pretty much going to guide you to the right direction. I think that's where change starts. And so I'm really grateful for what you're doing.
No, it's such a pleasure to talk to you.
And this was organic. I was not praising you. This was organic. My answer was completely organic.
Thank you so much.
Because I'm creating those spaces as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the things I find really heartening about this. Obviously, sentientism itself is framed as quite a naturalistic worldview and way of thinking. So some people might set that in opposition to religious worldviews too. But the thing I find heartening is that there are so many different paths to compassion, right? You can find it within the Abrahamic religions. You can find it within the Dharmic religions. You can find it in a completely naturalistic way of understanding the world. And we can all work together towards your idea of, a genuine universal interspecies justice and a central idea of mercy and compassion, right? That's what we can all be about, whatever our path might be. And even though we might have, very different beliefs in some areas, there's that powerful commonality. So yeah, more power to you. Well, it's been wonderful to talk to you, a genuine inspiration. I could carry on for hours, but I should probably let you go, given you're a few hours ahead of me. Firstly, is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation before I let you go? But also, how can people follow you and support your work and help out with the many different things you're doing?
So I have one very big project. I'm just going to mention it here. So in January 2025, 18th and 19th of January, I'm organizing my country's first ever International Animal and Environmental Rights Conference. So it's going to have people from not just my country, but across the world. And we would love, if you could share it and help us create this annual space. I mean, that was my previous answer, and a national space where you can talk about these things. So that's the idea. And we're going to have the best people ever come there and educate. And the audience would mostly be students, because at the end of the conference, I'm going to announce my plant-based curriculum for students as well. So it's going to bring and create a lot more courses in Pakistan. And hopefully this will be an annual event.
But that conference sounds like it will be a powerful step forward. Thank you.
Yeah. And I just want to mention one last thing, and I think it applies to everybody. So, leadership is actually very immersive. It's evolutionary. And my side of leadership is actually creating leaders who are better than myself. So giving it to them and creating a movement. That's what true leadership is. True leadership is not about you being the first person or the only person making a difference. What happens when you're not there? That's leadership.
Yeah, I love it. Inspirational message. You do so many things. So if there are other links you want to share that I can put in the show notes so people can plug into the other initiatives you're doing, please send them through and I'll include them so we can try and get you even more support. But yeah, I'm just overwhelmed and inspired at the sheer range and power of the things you're doing. And it's wonderful to hear. It's given me put a smile on my face for the rest of the day. So thank you so much for being a guest on Sentientism. It's a real pleasure. And please do stay in touch.
I will. Thank you so much for this space.
Cheers, Altamush.